My name is Serena Walsh. I am 36 years old. I am a forensic accountant and the founder of a financial consulting firm that last year processed over $90 million in client assets. And I want to tell you about the day I sat in a lawyer's office and watched my parents hand everything they had ever owned, their house, their savings, their business, their legacy, to my younger sister. Not because they had to, because they chose to. They looked me in the eye while the papers were being signed. My mother was crying, the good kind of crying, the proud kind. My father was smiling. My sister was sitting across from me in a cream blazer she had bought the week before specifically for this occasion, and she was smiling too. I was not in the will. Not partially. Not as a backup. Not for a single dollar. I had been removed 18 months earlier, after my sister told my parents something about me that was not true. That is the part one need to tell you. Because what she said, and what it cost me, and what happened 4 years later when her entire life collapsed and she picked up the phone and called me, that is the story. Before we go any further, if you have ever been erased from someone's life because of a lie someone else told, please hit subscribe right now and drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world people who understand this story are watching from. Stay with me. Every single part of what I am about to tell you matters. I need to start at the very beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, the quiet one. The one that explains everything else. My parents, Robert and Patricia Walsh, were not wealthy people. Not in the beginning. My father built a small tax preparation business over 30 years. A storefront on the main street of our small Ohio town. The kind of place with his name on the window in gold letters and an American flag on the door and a waiting room with plastic chairs and magazines that were always 2 years old. My mother kept the books. They built it together, slowly, the way people who don't have advantages build things. Carefully, with no margin for error, with the knowledge that there was no safety net underneath them if something went wrong. By the time I was in high school, the business was stable. Not spectacular. Stable. They owned the building, which was worth something. They had a house with a mortgage that was mostly paid off. They had a retirement account. For people who had started with nothing, they had built something real. I was the oldest by 4 years. My sister, Danielle, was born when I was 4.5, and from the very first moment she arrived in our house she was different from me. Not better, not worse. Different in the way that mattered in our family. She was soft where I was sharp. She was agreeable where I was questioning. She cried easily and my parents responded to that. I did not cry easily and my parents, without ever meaning to, I think, interpreted that as not needing them. I was the child who did not need. Danielle was the child who always did. And in a family where resources were tight and emotional bandwidth was limited, the child who did not need got less. That is not a tragedy. That is just how it worked. I understood it even then, in the blurry, instinctive way children understand things before they have words for them. What I had instead was my grandmother. My father's mother, Eleanor Walsh. A small, sharp-eyed woman who had raised 3 children alone after my grandfather died young, who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years, who could read a balance sheet faster than most people could read a sentence. She lived 20 minutes from us and I spent every Saturday at her kitchen table. She taught me how money worked. Not in the abstract way schools teach it. Not as a concept, not as a social problem, but as a language. She showed me ledgers. She showed me profit and loss. She showed me how a business actually breathes. How cash flow is different from profit, how timing matters, how the number on paper is not always the number in reality. She sat with me for hours. She explained things twice when I didn't understand and she didn't make me feel small for not understanding the first time. When I was 16 she said to me, "Serena, you have a mind for this. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't feminine." Nobody had told me that yet. But she knew someone would try. He was right. And she made sure I was ready for it. There are specific moments from my childhood that I return to not with self-pity, I am past that now, but because they explain who I became and why. The business conversation. I was 15. My father used to bring his work home on Fridays. Actual physical files, client folders, worksheets. He'd spread them on the dining room table after dinner and work for an hour or two while my mother watched television. I used to sit nearby and watch. One Friday I asked if I could look at one of the files. A simple one just to understand. He looked at me for a moment. Then he handed me a small business return for a client who owned a landscaping company. I sat with it for an hour. I found an error. A real error. A depreciation calculation that was off by about $800, not in our client's favor. I brought it to my father. He looked at it. He confirmed I was right. He fixed it. He said, "Good catch." Then he went back to work. The next morning, Danielle made him pancakes shaped like stars. He hung the photo she took of them on the refrigerator. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because this is how patterns get established. Danielle's love language was visible and domestic and easy to hang on a refrigerator. Mine was precise and technical and useful in ways that don't make good photos. My father loved me, but he didn't always know how to see me. The college fund. I was 17. There was a college fund. Modest, about $14,000, accumulated over many years of small contributions. My parents had one for me and one for Danielle, they said. Equal amounts set aside from the beginning. When I was accepted to the accounting program at the State University, with a partial merit scholarship, I sat down with my father to talk about how we would cover the rest. We went through the numbers together. The scholarship, the fund, what I would need to cover with loans or part-time work. At the end of the conversation, my father said something quietly. He said the fund for me was at $11,000, not $14,000. He said they had needed to move $3,000 out of it 2 years before when a cash flow gap hit the business. He said he was sorry. He said they would pay it back. I said it was fine. I meant it. I understood cash flow by then. I knew what a gap felt like. He paid back $1,000 of it before I graduated. Not because he didn't want to, because it was hard. I never mentioned the other $2,000, but I paid attention. I took note of the way good intentions and tight margins produce small betrayals that nobody officially acknowledges. I learned that money and love can be entirely separate things, or they can be the same thing depending on who's handling them. The business valuation. I was 24. I had just passed my CPA exam. I was working at a mid-size accounting firm. I was exhausted and proud, and I drove home for a weekend in October to celebrate with my family. At dinner, my father mentioned that a business broker had approached him about the tax practice. He wanted to sell eventually, not immediately but in the next 10 years. He was thinking about what it was worth and what they would do with the proceeds. I asked if I could look at the financials. He looked a little surprised. He said sure. That night I sat at the kitchen table with 4 years of the business's financial records and I did a proper valuation. 3 approaches: asset-based, income-based, market comparable. I put it all together in a clear document with my analysis and my conclusion, and I gave it to him Sunday morning before I drove back. He read it. He nodded. He said, "This is very thorough." He showed it to his accountant the following week. Not me, I found out later, his regular accountant, a man named Gary who had been doing the books for 15 years. Gary confirmed my analysis was accurate. My father never mentioned it again. He did not ask me to look at anything else for the business. He did not ask my opinion when the broker came back 2 years later. I am a forensic accountant. My father never once asked me to professionally consult on the business he spent 30 years building. But when Danielle redid the waiting room with a new paint color and some plants she bought at a craft store, my mother cried and said it made the whole place feel new. I want to be fair. Danielle's contribution was visible. Mine was invisible, the way structural things are invisible. And invisible things, no matter how essential, do not get thanked. If you've ever done the invisible work in your family, the real work, the work that actually keeps things standing, drop invisible in the comments. I see you. That was you. And subscribe if you're not already, because what Danielle does next is the part that changed everything. I am 30 years old in this part of the story. I want you to hold that in mind. 30. I had been a licensed CPA for 6 years. I was 2 years into a specialization in forensic accounting, the branch of the field that handles financial fraud, litigation support, hidden asset investigations. I had testified in 2 court cases. I was good at my job. I was very good at finding things that people had tried to hide. Danielle was 26. She had worked in my father's office since she was 22, handling the front desk, scheduling, client management, the social side of the business. She was genuinely good at it. Clients liked her. She remembered birthdays. She made the waiting room comfortable. I want to be honest, she contributed something real. But she had been telling my parents for about 2 years before this moment that she wanted to take over the business eventually. And my parents, without ever discussing it with me, had started to think of her as the heir apparent. I did not know this. I found out about it in the same conversation where everything else fell apart. It was a Sunday in March. My parents had asked me to come home, They said they wanted to talk about the business, about their plans, about the future. I thought they wanted my professional input. I drove 3 hours with a folder of documents I had prepared. Comparable sales data, tax implications of different transition structures, a preliminary succession plan. I sat down at the kitchen table. And my mother said, "Serena, we need to talk to you about something Danielle told us." I put the folder down. What Danielle had told them, carefully over a period of months in small installments, the way you construct something gradually so it looks like it was always there, was this. She had said that I had been privately advising a competitor, a larger regional tax and accounting firm that had been acquiring small independent practices across the state. She said I had been sharing information about our family's business, client lists, pricing structures, operational details, with this firm as a consultant, in preparation for them making an offer to acquire Walsh Tax Services. She said she had evidence. A conversation she had overheard. An email she had seen. A phone call I had made in the parking lot. She said she was heartbroken to tell them. She said she had stayed quiet for months hoping she was wrong. She said she had prayed about it. My father looked at me across the table. My mother was already crying. I said, "That is not true." My father said, "Danielle wouldn't make something like this up." That sentence. I have turned it over in my mind 10,000 times. Danielle wouldn't make something like this up. Not, "Let's look at the evidence." Not, "Serena, walk us through your side." Not, "This is a serious accusation and we need to be careful." Just, the conclusion reached before I had said a single word in my own defense. Reached because of who I was to them versus who Danielle was to them. I tried to explain. I asked what evidence she had shown them. I said I had never spoken to that firm. I said I could pull my phone records, my emails, my client logs. I said I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to document things, I knew what a paper trail looked like, and I was telling them there was no paper trail because nothing had happened. My mother said, "Why would she lie about this?" I did not have an answer that would satisfy them. Because the answer was, because she wants the business and she knows I'm the one who could have it. But saying that would sound like exactly what they expected me to say. It would sound defensive. It would sound like I was attacking Danielle. It would prove nothing. So I sat with the truth, clear, documented, real, and I watched my parents choose a story over me. I drove home that night. 3 hours. I did not cry until I was on the highway and there was no one to see me. Over the following 18 months, the damage compounded in the way damage does when nobody stops it. My parents changed their estate plan. I was not told directly. I found out through a family friend who was present at a dinner where my mother mentioned it. By the time I understood what had happened, the documents were already signed. Walsh Tax Services, the building, the business accounts, the equity, all of it directed to Danielle. The house to be split, but with Danielle having right of first purchase at below market value. The retirement accounts, those went to a charity which was their right. I was listed as a beneficiary for personal items. My grandmother's china. Some books. A watch that had belonged to my grandfather. I want to be clear about something. I was not devastated about the money. I had built my own income, my own savings, my own trajectory. I did not need my parents' assets to be financially stable. That is not what broke something in me. What broke something in me was the formality of it. The legal, witnessed, notarized formality. The fact that they had sat down with an attorney and said Serena gets nothing and signed their names to it. That is a different thing from the subtle slights of childhood. That is a decision. That is a document. I did not confront my parents. I thought about it for weeks. I wrote a letter I never sent. I drafted emails I deleted. And then I made a decision of my own. I would not spend my life fighting for the position of someone who was believed. I would spend my life building something that didn't require anyone's belief. I called my Aunt Claire, my mother's sister, the one person in my family who had always operated on evidence rather than feeling. I told her everything. She listened for a long time. Then she said, "Serena, what do you need right now?" I said, "I need someone to know the truth." She said, "I know the truth. Now build your life." I built my life. What do you think Danielle did with the business? Option A, she grew it into something real. Option B, she ran it into the ground. Option C, something worse than either. Drop your guess in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what happens to Walsh Tax Services over the next 4 years is something I could not have scripted. I need to tell you what I was doing during those 4 years because the contrast matters. Not to make myself look good, but because the parallel between what I was building and what was unraveling without me is the whole point of this story. After the meeting with my parents, I made two professional decisions. First, I left the firm I was at and accepted a position at a larger forensic accounting practice in Columbus, a place that worked exclusively on high-stakes financial litigation, fraud investigation, and asset recovery. Second, I enrolled in a graduate certificate program in financial forensics that I completed in 18 months. I was not doing this to prove something to my family. I was doing it because I was very good at finding the truth in numbers and I wanted to be in a room where that skill was valued. The forensic firm worked on cases that involved real money and real consequences. I investigated a municipal corruption scheme involving $11 million in diverted infrastructure funds. I was lead analyst on a fraud case against a mid-size manufacturing company where the CFO had been siphoning funds through shell entities for 9 years. $3 million hidden so carefully that 3 previous auditors had missed it. I found it in 6 weeks. I found things. That was what I did. I sat with numbers that were supposed to tell one story and I found the other story inside them. At year 2, a colleague named Marcus Webb, a former SEC investigator who had started his own consulting practice, asked me if I would consider a partnership. He had the client relationships, he said. I had the technical precision. Together we could build something significant. I said yes. Webb Serena Financial Consulting. He insisted my name go second because he said I was already the better known of the two in the forensic community, which was more about his generosity than reality. We worked out of a small office on the 5th floor of a building downtown. It was just the two of us and an assistant named Portia who was worth at least 3 of anyone else I'd ever worked with. Year 1 of the partnership. 4 major clients, total fees just under $2 million. Year 2. 11 clients, fees at $4.3 million. Year 3 we had to hire. Year 4, we had a team of 9, 2 satellite offices, and a reputation in the legal community that meant we were being called by the firms that other forensic consultants were not. I bought an apartment. I met my husband, David, at a conference in Chicago. He was a corporate attorney and we argued about the admissibility of forensic evidence for 40 minutes before we got dinner. We were engaged within the year. We were married in a small ceremony attended by Aunt Claire, Marcus and his wife, Portia, and a few close friends. My parents came. Danielle did not. The day was good. It was exactly what I needed it to be. I did not invite drama. I did not make speeches. I wore a dress I loved and I married a man who had never once looked at me like I was difficult to understand, and I let the day be simple. Simple was a thing I had learned to appreciate. Simple was the opposite of the family dynamics I had grown up in. Simple was a gift I was giving myself. I am going to tell you what was happening to Walsh Tax Services during those 4 years, because I need you to understand something about what happens when a business passes to the wrong person. Not a bad person but the wrong one. Danielle took over formally the year after the will was changed when my father decided to step back. He was 62. He was tired. He had worked hard his whole life and he deserved rest. He handed Danielle the keys, literally and figuratively, and stepped away. Danielle knew the clients. She knew the scheduling. She knew the front-of-house operation. What she did not know, what she had never needed to know because she had always relied on my father and Gary the accountant, was how to read the business's own financial health. She hired a new bookkeeper who was cheaper than Gary. She made some changes to pricing that felt intuitive but were not grounded in cost analysis. She took on some new clients who turned out to be high maintenance for low fees. She extended payment terms because clients asked and she hated saying no. None of these things were catastrophic individually. Together, over 2 years they created a cash flow problem. And then the cash flow problem became a debt problem. And then, in the way these things happen, the debt problem attracted the attention of someone who offered to help. A man named Preston Cole approached Danielle with what he described as a business development partnership. He was, by all appearances, a successful entrepreneur with connections in the professional services sector. He had a website, a LinkedIn profile with impressive credentials, an office in a good building in a good part of Columbus. He was also, I would discover this later when I was sitting with his financial records in front of me, under investigation by the State Attorney General's office for 3 separate instances of financial fraud against small business owners. The website was recent. The credentials were either exaggerated or fabricated. The office was a shared workspace he rented by the day. Danielle signed a partnership agreement with him. The terms were not good. I will not bore you with the details of exactly how the structure was designed to extract value from Walsh Tax Services over a period of 18 months. But I will tell you that it was carefully constructed, that it was not immediately visible in the surface numbers, and that by the time my parents realized something was wrong, really wrong, not just slower than usual wrong, Preston Cole had extracted approximately $240,000 from the business through a series of mechanisms that looked on paper like legitimate business expenses. My father called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He had not called me about the business in 4 years. He said, "Serena, I need your help." I want you to stop for a second and just feel that sentence. 4 years of silence. 4 years of being erased. 4 years of building alone. And then, "I need your help." Drop in the comments. What would you have said? Would you have helped? Type yes or a no and tell me why. And subscribe if you're not already here, because what Serena does next is the most important part of this whole story. I was at my desk when my father called. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. I had just come out of a 3-hour client meeting. I was tired and I had a stack of documents in front of me that needed my attention before morning. I looked at the name on my phone. I let it ring twice. I picked up. "Dad." His voice was different. Not older, he had aged in these 4 years. My aunt had told me the way people age when they've been worrying, but specifically different. There was something in it that I can only describe as small. He was a man whose voice had gotten small. He said, "Serena, I need your help." I said, "Okay." Just that. He said, "Something is wrong with the business. Something has been happening. Danielle, she got involved with someone, a man, a business partner. And I think he's been stealing from us. I think he's been." He stopped. I waited. "I don't know how to see it," he said. "The numbers. I can't. Gary retired and the new bookkeeper doesn't know what she's doing, and I've been looking at these statements and I can't." "Dad," I said. "Send me everything you have. Bank statements, contracts, ledgers, the partnership agreement, the business tax returns for the last 3 years. Everything." Silence. "You'll look at it?" "Yes," I said. Another silence. And then, "Serena, I know I don't have any right to ask, Dad," I said. "Send me the documents." I hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment. Outside my office window, the city was doing what cities do in October. Moving, lit, indifferent. I pulled a fresh legal pad toward me and I wrote one line across the top. Walsh Tax Services. Preliminary review. And then I went to work. I'm going to tell you what I found in those documents because I want you to understand something. The truth in numbers does not hide forever. It cannot. Numbers have to balance. The fiction has to be supported by more fiction, and eventually the weight of it collapses the structure. Preston Cole's arrangement with Walsh Tax Services was structured around 3 mechanisms. The first was a consulting fee structure, genuinely not unusual in a business development partnership, but set at a percentage of gross revenue rather than net, which meant the business was paying Cole whether or not it was profitable. The second was a series of vendor relationships that Cole had introduced, a digital marketing firm, a compliance software provider, a payroll service, all of which charged above market rates and all of which I quickly determined were entities connected to Cole either directly or through intermediaries. He was, in effect, billing the business through his own companies and pocketing the markup. The third, and this was the one that was going to be useful in court, was a loan structure. Cole had provided a short-term business loan to Walsh Tax Services at a critical moment when the cash flow issue had become acute. The loan documentation was structured in a way that gave him a security interest in the business's receivables. If the business missed a payment, and given the fee structure he had set up, it was only a matter of time before it did. He would have the legal right to collect directly from outstanding client invoices. In other words, he had engineered both the problem and the solution, and the solution was designed to eventually allow him to collect from the business's revenue stream directly, bypassing Danielle entirely. It was sophisticated. It was not the clumsiest fraud I had ever seen, but it was among the more elegant small business schemes in terms of how well the mechanisms reinforced each other. I documented everything, cross-referenced, built a timeline, identified the entities, flagged the regulatory issues. The state attorney general investigation I had found through public records meant there was already an investigative record that our findings could join. I put together a preliminary report, 42 pages, in 5 days. Then I called my father back. I said, "Dad, you have a fraud case. A serious one. I can connect you with a litigator who handles this type of matter. I can serve as the forensic expert. But I need you to understand, this is going to take time and it is going to be public and it is going to be difficult." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "How bad is it?" I said, "You can recover. The business has value. He hasn't destroyed it, he's been extracting from it. There's a difference. But you need to move now." He said, "Okay." Then he said, "Serena, I need to tell you something." I waited. He said, "I know that what we did, what your mother and I did with the will, with Danielle and her accusations, I know we were wrong. I have known for a long time." He stopped. Then, "I don't know why I couldn't say it sooner. I think I was ashamed. I think I didn't want to." Another stop. I said, "Dad, let's fix the business first. We can talk about the rest." He said, "Yes. Okay." We talked for another hour about next steps. Logistics. Strategy. The kind of conversation I had been trained for, prepared for, built for. The kind of conversation my father had never once had with me before about his own business in 30 years. About 8 months into the legal process, my father asked me to facilitate a full financial review of the business. The kind of comprehensive audit that would give them a clear picture of where they stood and what the recovery path looked like. Not just the fraud-related losses but the full picture. Assets, liabilities, client retention, revenue trajectory, the value of what remained and what it would take to stabilize it. He asked if I would present the findings to the family. He said he wanted Danielle there. He said he wanted my mother there. He said he wanted it to be the whole picture on the table for everyone. I said yes. The meeting was at the business. The actual office, the storefront with the gold letters on the window. We sat in the conference room my father had added about 10 years ago. A small room with a table that seated 8 and a whiteboard on one wall and a window that looked out onto the main street. My mother was there. Danielle was there. She looked like she had not slept well in months, which I suspected was true. My father was there. Aunt Claire was there because my father had asked her to be there as a neutral family presence. I set up my materials. I had a printed report for everyone. Organized, clear, color-coded in the way I always organize client reports. And I stood at the whiteboard and I walked them through it. The losses from the fraud. The recovery trajectory. The current client book and retention rates. The value of the business as it stood today versus what it had been 4 years ago. The realistic path forward. I was in that room for 2 hours. I talked about numbers. I talked about decisions. I talked about what was fixable and what was permanently lost and what would take time. I was precise. I was not warm in the way that Danielle was warm. I did not soften the difficult parts or apologize for them. The numbers were what they were. When I finished, I set down my marker. My father looked at me from across the table. He looked at me for a long moment and then he looked at my mother and then he looked at Danielle and then he looked back at me. He said, "We should have had you in this room 30 years ago." My mother was crying. The same kind of crying as the day the will was signed, but different. The same tears, different meaning. Danielle said nothing. She was looking at the table. But she was listening. I knew she was listening. Aunt Claire said, "Yes. You should have." Nobody argued with that. The reconciliation with my parents is ongoing. I want to be honest about that. I am not going to give you a clean, packaged ending where everything is forgiven and the family is whole again and we all have Sunday dinners and take Christmas photos. That is not this story. This is a story about real people making real repairs, which takes time and is sometimes awkward and does not always feel like progress even when it is. What I can tell you is this. My father and I talk twice a week now. He asks about my cases. Not in detail because the details are confidential, but in the way he asks about my work that tells me he is genuinely interested. He asks how David is. He asks if I am sleeping enough. He has started saying, "I love you" at the end of phone calls, which he did not used to do. I say it back. I mean it. My mother and I are slower. He carries the guilt differently than my father. He processes it by moving, by doing, by asking questions and taking action. She processes it by being very careful with me, too careful sometimes, and the caution creates its own distance. We are working on it. We have good moments and uncomfortable ones, and that is what repair looks like when you are doing it honestly. I brought David to their house for Thanksgiving last year. It was the first Thanksgiving I had spent with my family in 5 years. My mother made the same meal she had always made. My father carved the turkey. Danielle was not there. She and my parents are also in a process of repair, a different one, slower and more complicated. Aunt Claire was there. We watched a bad football game afterward and argued about the call in the fourth quarter, and it was, for a few hours, exactly like a normal family. I drove home that night with David and I looked out the window at the highway lights and I thought about the 16-year-old version of me sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table learning how money works. I thought about Eleanor Walsh saying, "You have a mind for this. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't feminine." I thought about all the times I had sat in rooms where my precision was invisible, where my contribution left no photograph on the refrigerator, where the work I did was essential and unseen and unremarked. And I thought about that conference room. The whiteboard. 2 hours. My father saying, "We should have had you in this room 30 years ago." About 8 months into the legal process, my father asked me to facilitate a full financial review of the business. The kind of comprehensive audit that would give them a clear picture of where they stood and what the recovery path looked like. Not just the fraud-related losses but the full picture. Assets, liabilities, client retention, revenue trajectory, the value of what remained and what it would take to stabilize it. He asked if I would present the findings to the family. He said he wanted Danielle there. He said he wanted my mother there. He said he wanted it to be the whole picture on the table for everyone. I said yes. The meeting was at the business. The actual office, the storefront with the gold letters on the window. We sat in the conference room my father had added about 10 years ago. A small room with a table that seated 8 and a whiteboard on one wall and a window that looked out onto the main street. My mother was there. Danielle was there. She looked like she had not slept well in months, which I suspected was true. My father was there. Aunt Claire was there because my father had asked her to be there as a neutral family presence. I set up my materials. I had a printed report for everyone. Organized, clear, color-coded in the way I always organize client reports. And I stood at the whiteboard and I walked them through it. The losses from the fraud. The recovery trajectory. The current client book and retention rates. The value of the business as it stood today versus what it had been 4 years ago. The realistic path forward. I was in that room for 2 hours. I talked about numbers. I talked about decisions. I talked about what was fixable and what was permanently lost and what would take time. I was precise. I was not warm in the way that Danielle was warm. I did not soften the difficult parts or apologize for them. The numbers were what they were. When I finished, I set down my marker. My father looked at me from across the table. He looked at me for a long moment and then he looked at my mother and then he looked at Danielle and then he looked back at me. He said, "We should have had you in this room 30 years ago." My mother was crying. The same kind of crying as the day the will was signed, but different. The same tears, different meaning. Danielle said nothing. She was looking at the table. But she was listening. I knew she was listening. Aunt Claire said, "Yes. You should have." Nobody argued with that. The reconciliation with my parents is ongoing. I want to be honest about that. I am not going to give you a clean, packaged ending where everything is forgiven and the family is whole again and we all have Sunday dinners and take Christmas photos. That is not this story. This is a story about real people making real repairs, which takes time and is sometimes awkward and does not always feel like progress even when it is. What I can tell you is this. My father and I talk twice a week now. He asks about my cases. Not in detail because the details are confidential, but in the way he asks about my work that tells me he is genuinely interested. He asks how David is. He asks if I am sleeping enough. He has started saying, "I love you" at the end of phone calls, which he did not used to do. I say it back. I mean it. My mother and I are slower. He carries the guilt differently than my father. He processes it by moving, by doing, by asking questions and taking action. She processes it by being very careful with me, too careful sometimes, and the caution creates its own distance. We are working on it. We have good moments and uncomfortable ones, and that is what repair looks like when you are doing it honestly. I brought David to their house for Thanksgiving last year. It was the first Thanksgiving I had spent with my family in 5 years. My mother made the same meal she had always made. My father carved the turkey. Danielle was not there. She and my parents are also in a process of repair, a different one, slower and more complicated. Aunt Claire was there. We watched a bad football game afterward and argued about the call in the fourth quarter, and it was, for a few hours, exactly like a normal family. I drove home that night with David and I looked out the window at the highway lights and I thought about the 16-year-old version of me sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table learning how money works. I thought about Eleanor Walsh saying, "You have a mind for this. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't feminine." I thought about all the times I had sat in rooms where my precision was invisible, where my contribution left no photograph on the refrigerator, where the work I did was essential and unseen and unremarked. And I thought about that conference room. The whiteboard. 2 hours. My father saying, "We should have had you in this room 30 years ago." I want to end with Danielle because I think she is the most complicated part of this story and I do not want to leave her without complexity. He and I are not close. I do not know if we will be. The lie she told was not a small one. It was not a misunderstanding or an exaggeration or a mistake made under pressure. It was a constructed thing built over time with my erasure as its intended result. I cannot pretend otherwise and I would not insult either of us by trying. But I also know this. Danielle is not someone who was born malicious. She is someone who was afraid and whose fear made her do something terrible and who has had to live with that, and with the consequences of it, which were significant, for a long time. I do not know exactly what her interior life looks like now. I do not have access to it. We do not talk in the way that would give me that access. What I know from the outside is this. She is working. She is still involved with the business, though in a reduced capacity. She is in therapy, which my father mentioned and which I think is good. She reached out to me last spring. A text message, simple, no drama. "I hope you're well. I mean that." I responded, "I know you do. I hope the same for you." We have not spoken since. Maybe that will change. Maybe it won't. I have stopped needing to know the answer to that question in order to move forward. I have been thinking about what this story means. Not the narrative of it. I know the narrative, I lived it. But the meaning underneath. Here is what I know. I know that being the capable one in a family does not protect you from being overlooked. Capability without warmth is invisible in a family system that rewards warmth. I was precise and useful and reliable, and none of those things made me seen. They made me useful in a crisis and forgettable in ordinary time. I know that the people who hurt us are not always our enemies. My parents were not my enemies. Danielle, even at her worst, was not my enemy. They were people with limited bandwidth and their own fears and their own blind spots who made choices that cost me something real. That is different from evil. It does not make it okay. But it is different, and the difference matters for what you do next. I know that building in silence is not the same as accepting invisibility. I was not invisible. I was building in a room where no one was watching, which is entirely different. The work was real. The results were real. The watching was just delayed. I know that being needed by people who once dismissed you is not revenge. It felt like nothing so clean as revenge when my father called me. It felt like grief, actually, like mourning the 30 years of conversations we had not had, the 30 years of cases I had not consulted on, the 30 years of his work I had not been invited into. It felt like arriving to a place I should have been all along, too late to have been there for the whole journey. But also, and this is the part one hold on to, I know that I arrived. That I came when called. That I sat in that conference room and I did the work and I did it well and I did it without making anyone feel small for having needed me. That is something I chose. It is not nothing. And I know this. You can be erased from someone's story and still write your own. They are different documents. The one they wrote about you is theirs. The one you write is yours. And your version, the one built from facts, from work, from precision, from showing up, that one does not need their signature to be true. Last month, my father had the sign on the window repainted. Walsh Tax Services. ST 1987. He sent me a photo of it. I looked at it for a long time. Gold letters. White background. 38 years of mornings and tax seasons and plastic chairs in a waiting room and a man who pressed his shirts and shook hands with everyone he passed on the sidewalk. I texted back, "It looks good, Dad." He called immediately. He said, "I've been thinking. When you have time, and no pressure, I know you're busy, I'd like to talk about a consulting relationship. Formal. Paid. I want you to review the business quarterly. I want your eyes on it." I said, "I'd like that." He said, "I should have asked 20 years ago." I said, "Yes. But you're asking now." He said, "Yes. I am." We made a time for the first call. I hung up and I went back to work. Outside my window the city was building. The way cities always are, always building, cranes on the horizon, scaffolding coming down somewhere as it goes up somewhere else. The constant project of making things that last. I pulled a new file toward me. I opened it. I started looking for the truth inside the numbers. That is what I do. That is what I have always done. And now, finally, the right people know it. If this story found you, if you have been the invisible one, the capable one, the one who built alone while someone else got the credit, share this video. Send it to someone who needs it. And subscribe because these stories need to be told and I will keep telling them. Drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.